Shopify grows your business no matter how far or big you grow. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. Whether you're selling your fans' next favorite shirt or an exclusive piece of podcast merch, Shopify helps you sell everywhere. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the U.S. Allbirds, Rothy's, Brooklinen, and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Plus, Shopify's award-winning help is there to support your success every step of the way. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network.
The turn of recent events in Europe, if truly represented, must strengthen the motives to get rid of the war with us, and their hopes by a continuance of it to break down our government must be more and more damped by occurrences here as they become known there. James Madison to Thomas Jefferson, 10th of May, 1814.
Sir, it is much to be apprehended that the great and unexpected events which have so entirely changed the state of affairs in Europe may have a serious effect on the nature and aspect of the war carried on by Great Britain against the United States, as well as on the proposed negotiations of peace. This state of things and the security drive by Great Britain from the restoration of the Bourbons on the throne of France, and from the expulsion of Bonaparte to Elba, puts at the disposition of this government the whole of their force heretofore employed against France. It might also be inconvenient here to reduce suddenly the army and navy to a peace establishment, and there can be no doubt that if the war continue, as great a portion of that disposable force as will be competent to the objects of the British government will be employed in America. James A. Bayard and Albert Gallatin to Secretary of State James Monroe, 6 May 1814.
June 1814 marked the second anniversary of war being declared on Great Britain, and leaders in the United States had to wonder just what had been achieved thus far. Taking Canada from British control had proven more challenging than expected. The side conflict in East Florida had ended with an utter failure of wresting that colony from the Spanish. The only success to date had been to defeat Muskogee forces in the Southwest, territory that, at least on paper, was already in the American boundary, but would that August, thanks to the dubious Treaty of Fort Jackson, now be open to white settlement. With no new territory secured, thousands killed and captured, commerce disrupted, and the nation's finances in shambles, it was no wonder that folks were willing to give peace a chance. There was just one problem, though. Now that the Napoleonic Wars in Europe were wrapping up, the British were ready to fight, and officials back at home were misinterpreting it as more of an inducement for the British to seek peace, while the nation's diplomats in Europe knew that it might result in disaster for the United States. Before it gets to that, though, I'd like to welcome you to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. Special thanks to John from the Generals and Napoleon podcast and Lori from Her Half of History for providing the opening quotes for this episode. Starting with the reader of the Madison quote, Lori has been hosting Her Half of History since January 2021 and has taken her listeners through various accounts of women's history around the globe. From well-known figures such as Marie Antoinette, to women with whom you may not be quite as familiar, such as Ranavalona I of Madagascar, Lori's research encapsulates a wide spectrum of women's history. She organizes her episodes in series with themes, such as Series 3 on women involved in finance and business, Series 10 on great female painters, and Series 4 on enslaved women. Whether going through the biography of a female historical figure or covering a topic in women's history, every episode is full of insightful information and reflects Lori's dedication to the subject. Check out Her Half of History anywhere fine podcasts can be found, or you can go to our website, herhalfofhistory.com, to find out more. On the surface, it would seem that the focus of generals in Napoleon would be simple: Napoleon Bonaparte and the generals that served under him. However, John takes a more expansive approach to the subject matter, and anyone interested in the Napoleonic era benefits from this in the process. Naturally, John does have episodes focused on the marshals of France under the French First Empire. He also examines the lives and careers of some of the military commanders that the emperor and his French army faced off against over the years, as well as famous battles during the time, and key figures in the political and social milieu of the era. If you're interested in European history in the late 18th and early 19th century, then you'll want to give Generals and Napoleon a listen. Search for Generals and Napoleon on your favorite podcast app of choice, or check out the YouTube channel, which is at Generals and Napoleon. Links to find more information about both of these podcasts will be on the page for this episode on my website, which is presidenciespodcast.com.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol, about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.
As if there wasn't enough going on, I should bring up something that was last mentioned in episode 4.22. As we discussed then, there were 12 American prisoners that had been held hostage by the Algerine government in North Africa since August 1812. While the Madison administration was none too pleased about this situation, there was little that they could do while they were fighting a war against Great Britain, the largest naval power in the world at the time. Thus, President Madison and Secretary of State James Monroe decided that they should try the diplomatic route. While both men had criticized the policy of the Washington and Adams administrations in paying tribute to the Barbary states in order to secure peace, it seemed that was the only option remaining to them on how to get the hostages back. In order for their mission to be a success, they would have to choose a skilled diplomat who could be discreet in their approach to the Algerine government. The man they chose, however, was someone who had no diplomatic experience. Mordecai Noah was a native of Philadelphia in his late 20s when the president appointed him as U.S. consul to Tunis. His father was a German immigrant, while his mother was from a prominent Jewish family in New York City. Noah had a rather challenging childhood, as his father abandoned the family 6 years after his birth, but he ultimately established himself as, quote, a newspaperman, a vigorous pamphleteer for Jefferson's Republican Party, and a playwright. At a time when there are estimated to have been only around 4,000 Jewish Americans in the nation, most in established cities such as New York, Charleston, and Philadelphia, Noah, rather than downplaying his background, quote, openly and aggressively relied on his Jewish identity to gain personal advantage. Noah would not be the first Jewish American diplomat, as President Jefferson had appointed Solomon Nonez as the U.S. Consul General to Portugal during his tenure, and it's quite possible that knowing that he wouldn't be the first helped give Noah confidence that he too, as so many other prominent Americans were doing, could use a federal appointment, quote, as a method of gaining wealth, developing connections that would help him later, and seeing the world. While Noah had been appointed and confirmed as U.S. Consul in Riga in June 1811, for some reason, Noah did not take up that post, and instead asked to be named as a consul to one of the Barbary states on the North African coast. The decision to appoint Noah to the diplomatic posting in Tunis in March 1813 was not due to a personal knowledge of Noah, as the president was far from well acquainted with Noah at that point. Instead, it seems that the decision was likely made as it was felt a Jewish person might have a better chance in achieving results in outreach efforts to Algiers, as there was a strong, prominent Jewish community in the Barbary states that Noah could potentially gain entree to in order to use their influence for America's benefit. As Monroe's instructions to Noah read, quote, on your way to Tunis, perhaps at Malaga or Marseille, you may probably devise means for the liberation of our unfortunate countrymen at Algiers, whose situation has excited the warmest sympathy of their friends, and indeed of the people generally of this country. Should you find a suitable channel through which you can negotiate their immediate release, you are authorized to go as far as $3,000 a man, but a less sum may probably affect the object. Whatever may be the result of the attempt, you will, for obvious reasons, not let it be understood to proceed from this government, but rather from the friends of the parties themselves. Just to make that clear, though Noah was receiving direct instructions from the Madison administration to offer a ransom for the release of the hostages, he was told to lie about the source of the offer, that it was the friends of the hostages seeking their freedom rather than the federal government that put him up to make the overture. Remember that, dear friends. Noah set sail in late May, but his ship was captured by the British, and he was sent to England for 9 weeks before finally being provided with a passport and being allowed to proceed to Cadiz, where he made contact with the U.S. consul there and consulted with him for advice on how to proceed with this secret mission. Noah engaged with a merchant and adventurer named Richard R. Keene, and the two went first to Gibraltar, then Keene went off on his own to Algiers in mid-January 1814. Yes, Noah had subcontracted out the diplomatic mission. The two had apparently not been subtle about the inquiries they had made thus far, because, as noted by historian Frederick C. Lanier, quote, when Keene arrived in Algiers in February 1814, it was immediately apparent that word of the confidential mission was everywhere. Even Haji Ali bin Khalil, the Dey of Algiers, had heard of Keene's mission and demanded to know his purpose. Keene put forward the story about friends of the captives seeking their release. The Dey's reply, quote, my policy and my views are to increase, not to diminish the number of my American slaves, and that not for $1 million would I release them. Keene's mission wasn't a complete loss, however. In coordination with the British consul, he was able to secure the release of 2 of the Edwin seamen, as well as 4 sailors who had been impressed into the British Navy, but claimed to be from Louisiana, and made a bid for freedom when the British frigate they were on arrived in Algiers. Keene returned to Cadiz in late May 1814 and turned in his expenses to Noah. The cost of Keene's mission, along with the expenses to send the 6 men home and Noah's own expenses to date, came to a total of $25,910. When the Madison administration found out just how much Noah was charging back to them for the freedom of only 2 of the 12, remember, they had authorized a ransom of $3,000 per person, and who are these 4 others anyway? They were furious, and they, quote, decided not to honor the bills of exchange Noah drafted on the ground that Noah had not acted in conformity with his instructions. We'll go more into how the administration changed tack on their approach to secure the release of the hostages in a future episode. But just know that, on April 25, 1815, Secretary of State Monroe sent a letter to Noah asserting that, quote, at the time of your appointment as consul at Tunis, it was not known that the religion which you profess would form any obstacle to the exercise of your consular functions. Recent information, however, on which entire reliance may be placed, process that it would produce a very unfavorable effect, in consequence of which the President has deemed it expedient to revoke your commission. On the receipt of this letter, therefore, you will consider yourself no longer in the public service. To put it succinctly, this was all bulldookie. They knew Noah was Jewish when he was offered the position, and further, Lanier, in his recounting of this incident, found no evidence in the primary sources of an official complaint by the Dey of Tunis, or anyone else for that matter, regarding Noah's religion. Noah will return to the U.S. and continue his, quote, literary and political pursuits in New York. Funny enough, in 1818, when he gave a speech consecrating the building of a new synagogue, a speech that, quote, focused on the theme of the persecution of the Jews in countries that lacked democracy, he sent copies to former Presidents Adams, Jefferson, and, yes, Madison. All 3 responded and, quote, expressed broad support for Jews' civil rights. Madison even threw into his response, written on May 15, 1818, that, quote, it is certain that your religious profession was well known at the time you received your commission. and that in itself, it could not be a motive for your recall. Really? Really? With that unpleasant episode fully covered, let's get back to the time of Madison's presidency and catch up on what was happening in South America in the time after the U.S. declared war on Britain, as that too will have an impact on our upcoming narrative. Though, as covered in episode 4.29, the First Republic of Venezuela had come to an end in August 1812, this did not mean that it was the end of the independence movement on the north coast of South America. Indeed, one of the men who had been responsible for the downfall of longtime Venezuelan revolutionary leader Francisco de Miranda had been busy plotting for a new overthrow of authorities loyal to the Spanish crown. Simón Bolívar had been exiled from the colony due to his close ties to the revolutionary government, but by November, he arrived at another South American city that had declared its independence from Spain, Cartagena. Bolívar joined up with the forces of New Granada and was assigned a command at a remote outpost called Barranca. Before taking up this command, however, Bolívar dropped a testimonial entitled A Manifesto from the Venezuelan Colonel Simón Bolívar to the citizens of New Granada. As described by Bolívar biographer Marie Arana, quote, the Cartagena Manifesto, as it became known, stands as one of the great documents of Latin American history. While deploring the fall of the Venezuelan Republic, Bolívar stressed that New Granada had a chance to achieve permanent independence if they remained united. When Bolívar took over his new command of 70 men, he immediately set about recruiting more. Again, from Arana, quote, the only men willing to be recruited came from the dregs of society, slum dwellers, runaway slaves, out-of-work peasants, near-naked tribesmen. They were untrained, undisciplined, weaponless, shoeless, with little more than a pair of tattered trousers, a flea-ridden blanket, a frayed hat. This did not deter Bolívar. Even when receiving orders forbidding him from proceeding with his plan, Bolívar on December 21st took the royalist stronghold of Tenerife, despite having the smaller force, and kept moving forward. Arana notes that, quote, he had learned a lesson from Miranda's indecisions. By January 8, 1813, 15 days after beginning the campaign, Bolívar and his troops had secured the entire length of the Magdalena River for the Republicans. Then he took the city of Ocaña to prepare for an invasion of Venezuela. There, he waited for approval to lead an invasion into his homeland. The New Granadan government, however, asked Bolívar to help take out a royalist force at Cucuata before they would be willing to greenlight his invasion. This battle, on February 28th, quote, was bloody, uneven. But yet again, Bolívar led his troops to victory, with the Spanish general in charge falling in the conflict. Despite winning the independence of New Granada and being elevated to the rank of brigadier general, Bolívar still found himself at a loss as to how to convince New Granadans to agree to an invasion of Venezuela. Indeed, an officer and 100 troops under his command resigned rather than agree to join in an invasion. Finally, though, on May 23rd, Bolívar led a force down from the Andes Mountains into the valley of Mérida and took that province without a problem. By June 14th, Bolívar was in control of the province of Trujillo. By this time, however, the pro-Spanish administration in Venezuela had issued, quote, a royal decree that called for the extermination of all avowed Republicans, without exceptions. Bolívar considered this and proclaimed that, quote, we've run out of goodness. Now that the enemy has forced us to a deadly war, we will eradicate them from America, and this land will finally be purged of the monsters that infest it. Our hatred will be implacable, and our war will be to the death. Though, as we'll see, there would be plenty over the years who would equate Simón Bolívar with George Washington and the South American Wars of Independence with the Revolutionary War that led to the creation of the United States, there would be some clear points of divergence that would have important impacts in what was to come. For now, though, we'll leave General Bolívar there and catch up with what was happening with our old friend, General Harrison. We left Harrison at the end of episode 4.30 with a decisive victory at the Battle of the Thames. At the time, it looked like the entirety of Upper Canada might be his for the taking. However, Harrison and his naval counterpart, Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, were strategic thinkers. While the forces of their British and native enemies might be scattered, a key part of Harrison's command, the volunteers from Kentucky, were nearing the end of their terms of enlistment and were ready to return home victorious. Simultaneously, they were at the limit of where they could expect Perry's ships to continue to provide support if Harrison wanted to take the army further into Upper Canada. Meanwhile, the two commanders were receiving orders from Washington that were leading them in different directions. If possible, the administration wanted them to retake Mackinac Island in Lake Huron. Once that was done, or if it wasn't possible, Harrison was directed, quote, to assign any surplus of regulars in his command to the Niagara frontier, and Perry was to transport them there. After quickly realizing that the former was not feasible, Harrison and Perry proceeded with putting the latter into action. After the Kentuckian troops departed, Harrison settled into his base of operations in Detroit and, quote, began working on several items that remained on his agenda, planning an expedition against Fort Michilimackinac, concluding an armistice with the Indians, establishing civil government in Michigan and the occupied Western District of Upper Canada, and moving many of his regulars to the Niagara Peninsula on Perry's vessels. He also found himself responsible for providing food for both natives and whites living on the Detroit frontier and conveying British prisoners to Ohio and Kentucky. Before long, Harrison began to turn his mind to operations on the Niagara front, and by October 24th, Harrison was in Buffalo. At first, it seemed like him and Secretary of War John Armstrong were on the same page about carrying out operations against Burlington Heights and York. As Harrison positioned the forces under his command for this purpose, unbeknownst to him, Armstrong sent orders on November 3rd for some of the forces that Harrison was counting on to move to Sackett's Harbor. Though Skaggs acknowledges that, quote, the defense of the only U.S. naval base and shipyard on Lake Ontario was a high priority for the Army, this also, quote, deprived Harrison of an opportunity to exploit British weaknesses on the Niagara frontier. And it doesn't seem that there was any indication that an attack on Sackett's Harbor was imminent. What, then, was Armstrong's motivation? Like many other American leaders, Armstrong saw the War of 1812 as an opportunity to gain some martial glory for himself. Indeed, despite being the Secretary of War, a civilian government officer, Armstrong had spent the fall of 1813 on the front in New York and was completely focused on operations in that theater to the neglect of all other fronts, including what had transpired in the Northwest. Given Harrison's recent success with the Battle of the Thames, it was probably for the best that Armstrong had been preoccupied, as they had already gone back and forth on the issue of recruiting regular officers versus depending on militia forces. Armstrong was in favor of the former, while Harrison, being from the West, knew that was infeasible. Now, though, Harrison was being lauded across the nation for his wartime victory, and Armstrong was seething. As noted by Skaggs, quote, it became increasingly apparent that the Secretary of War would not give Harrison an opportunity for another victory, nor would he allow him to assume command outside the 8th Military District. Harrison was outside the 8th District at Niagara, and Armstrong maneuvered to deny him an opportunity for military success there. Harrison went to meet Armstrong in Albany in mid-November, but their discussions did not resolve the tensions between them. Then, Harrison fueled the flames when he proceeded to Philadelphia, where a dinner was held in his honor, and he publicly expressed his support for the militia, asserting that, quote, they possess the Roman spirit, and when our government shall think it proper to give them that organization and discipline of which they are susceptible, they will perform deeds that will emulate those of legions led by Marcellus and Scipio. This was a clear public rebuke of Armstrong, who had been pushing for a conscription law to expand the regular army. Meanwhile, our old friend General James Wilkinson had suffered a loss in a half-hearted march to Montreal and had turned around at the first sign of trouble. Wilkinson, like Harrison, had issues with Secretary Armstrong and shifting plans and a lack of clarity on his role in operations. However, in addition to the calamity of errors that was operations in the northern theater of the war, Wilkinson also had to come to terms with the realities of aging. At 56, he had 16 years on Harrison and struggled to deal with conditions out in the field, especially as summer gave way to fall. His health suffered from the travel, and he spent critical days bedridden rather than being able to direct plans for the invasion. Wilkinson's behavior grew increasingly erratic, and though there was suspicion of him being drunk, his ill health meant that he was being treated with laudanum, which is a tincture of opium. Thus, it's not surprising that, despite having a numerical advantage over the opposing force, the Battle of Chrysler's Farm was lost on November 11, 1813, thus putting an end to the Montreal campaign. At this point, Wilkinson played a classic card out of his usual deck. He decided to blame someone else for the problems with his command. The person he had in mind was General Wade Hampton, a fellow Army officer who Wilkinson had been in dispute with since both of them had been stationed in New Orleans earlier in the war, as discussed in episode 4.21. Wilkinson criticized Hampton's refusal to obey his orders as resulting in the loss, but Secretary Armstrong wasn't having it and laid the blame squarely at Wilkinson's door. Wilkinson then went on to compound the damage by establishing a winter quarters at French Mills just on the New York side of the U.S.-Canadian border near what is modern-day Fort Covington. Unfortunately, by this point, it was mid-November, in a time that climatological conditions were on average even colder in that part of the world at this time of the year. As described by Lieutenant Reynold Kirby on November 16th, quote, "The face of the country where we are now located, with the prospect of remaining a long time, is wild and uninhabited. It will be long ere we shall be under the cover of our huts, which we are about to erect. The weather is cold, and the ice is forming in the river." For those of you who remember, as discussed in episode 4.5, the Terre aux Boeufs disaster of 1809, where Wilkinson had ordered the men under his command to establish a camp in harsh conditions that resulted in numerous deaths while he found comfortable lodgings for himself. Yeah, this is basically that same scenario again, but only in a winter landscape in New York rather than the pestilent swamps of Louisiana. It wouldn't be until Christmas Day that the huts at the winter camp were completed and regular deliveries of food were established. So in the course of over a month of being exposed to the elements with a lack of nourishment, there were naturally common soldiers who fell ill and passed away, while Wilkinson was ensconced in the nearby village of Four Corners. A far cry from New Orleans, where he had established his headquarters in 1809 while his men were dying at Terre aux Boeufs, but still much better conditions than the soldiers under his command. Facing rising mortality and desertion numbers, Wilkinson finally realized that there was a problem and made arrangements for 450 patients to be moved and treated, quote, in the settlement of Malone, 10 miles to the south, where he had his headquarters. By January 27, 1814, however, of the 8,143 men that Wilkinson had started the campaign with, only 4,777 were still ready for duty. If you thought this would stop James Wilkinson, however, then you don't know James Wilkinson. While Armstrong worked behind the scenes to transfer men out from Wilkinson's command and warn folks not to cooperate with him while official charges were being drawn up in Washington, General Wilkinson proceeded on with plans for an early spring attack on the Canadian stronghold of La Colle-Mille on the road to Montreal. On March 29th, he led a force of just under 4,000 men and told those under his command that, quote, every officer and every man must return victorious, or not at all, for with double the force of the enemy, this army must not give ground. As you can probably guess, dear listener, this attack ended in disaster. First, they apparently started out without maps, so, as described by Linkletter, quote, his inexperienced scouts became lost, and the heaviest of his artillery, the 18-pounders, sank axle deep in slushy mud. When they somehow found their way to the target and began the attack on March 30th, the stone walls proved more than a match for Wilkinson's guns, and after 2 days of firing without making any progress, the general on April 1st, that's right, April Fool's Day, issued orders for the guns and his men to return to camp. The fool in this case was not the orders, but Wilkinson himself. Indeed, by this point, word was already en route to the general that official charges were being brought against him, and he was to be relieved of command once more, pending the results of the third court-martial he would face in his long military career. We'll get to this court-martial in a future episode, but just know that things were not looking good for the scoundrel Wilkinson. We've seen him get out of other scrapes, though, so we'll have to wait to see what happens. Meanwhile, as discussed back in episode 4.26, the British had set up a loose blockade on the East Coast at the beginning of the war. Initially focused on the Chesapeake and Delaware bays, it was expanded to, quote, the entire coast south of Rhode Island. However, one key region of the eastern seaboard exempted from it was New England. While some historians have attributed this to rewarding the stronger pro-British and anti-war sentiment in that region, Walter Borman asserts that this was a decision made by the British Admiralty, quote, more realistically, to allow some neutral trade between Canada and the West Indies. A commercial blockade meant that ships of any flag, even declared neutrals, attempting to cross a blockade were fair game for seizure, because the accepted principle of international law ran, by endeavoring to defeat the efforts of one belligerent by running the blockade, they made themselves parties to the war. Thus, New England was still able to carry on a trade with their largest trading partner, Britain. Realizing that this was going on and potentially undermining the administration's war efforts, Madison in the summer of 1813 proposed an embargo against Britain, but Federalists in Congress were able to thwart this legislation. By December 1813, the president and his congressional supporters renewed their efforts, and by the 17th, Madison was affixing his signature to a new embargo act. Naturally, this, quote, embargo on exports and the prohibition of imports that came primarily from Britain hit New England hard. As noted by historian James M. Banner Jr., quote, the administration enforced the embargo with a rigor disastrous to the flourishing smuggling enterprises of New England's borders and to the people of Nantucket, which put an end to Federalist patience. As soon as late December, a town meeting in Massachusetts, quote, instructed the town's representatives to the Massachusetts General Court to propose a convention of New Englanders to consider what action could be taken in the awful crisis. In February, the state legislature, quote, approved the plan for an interstate convention to amend the Constitution, but in an attempt to provide not only more time for planning, but also an opportunity to cloak the convention with popular legitimacy, it recommended first seeking public approval at the spring elections. The Federalist Party of Massachusetts was going to the people. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Madison and the administration were getting flack for the embargo. New England had provided little support to the war effort to date. As described by Perkins, quote, Federalists opposed the administration with their voices, votes, and hearts, as well as with their dollars. Federalist governors in New England challenged the government's right to send militia beyond the borders of their home states. With any of the bond issues from the Treasury Department to fund the war effort, quote, New England virtually boycotted it, and their bankers kept their monetary resources locked away in their coffers. Now, though, with New Englanders up in arms and calling for a convention to oppose the administration, the president reconsidered his stance on the embargo and asked Congress to repeal it only a few months after it was put into place. Congress quickly agreed, and the embargo was no more. The sad thing, according to Jane Hampton Cook, is that it was actually working. Cook explains that, quote, the embargo had negatively affected the British military's ability to acquire rope, cotton, and other supplies. Thus, not only did the embargo prompt New England Federalists to call for a convention, it also prompted the British to rethink their blockade policy. A new commander of the British North American Squadron was sent to replace Sir John Borlase Warren, who we discussed back in episodes 4.22 and 4.23. This new commander, Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, had managed to get concurrence from the ministry, quote, that coddling New England paid few dividends. Thus, when he arrived to take up his command in April 1814, one of the first commands was to establish a general blockade of the American coast. As noted by Perkins, quote, the prices of coffee, sugar, and textiles, already far higher than in peacetime, rocketed upward. Staple growers suffered a further decline in the prices of cotton and foodstuffs. Coming right after the detrimental impact of the embargo proclaimed by their own government, New Englanders were hit hard by the expanded British blockade. That region of the nation, however, would not be the target of Cochrane's planned naval assault. As discussed in episode 4.27, British Admiral George Cockburn had led raids along the Chesapeake the year prior and had set Hampton, Virginia, ablaze. Admiral Cochrane had been thinking about what a naval attack on the American coast would look like for the last 2 years, and as he made his way first to Bermuda, then to U.S. waters that spring, he finalized his plans. Cochrane would find that he had an eager herald already hard at work in the form of Cockburn. After having to withdraw in the fall, Cockburn returned to the Chesapeake area in late February 1814 to scout out, quote, some convenient island or point within the Chesapeake, which would serve as a base of operations as well as a rallying point for enslaved individuals seeking their freedom behind British lines. Cockburn chose Tangier Island, which sent the Chesapeake between the northern neck to the west and the Delmarva Peninsula to the east. Cockburn had established a small base there when he left for Bermuda in the fall, but he judged it the proper place to establish a larger footprint in order to coordinate operations through the entire Chesapeake. As he began to set up his new headquarters, he learned that he had a new commander and was thrilled to hear that Cochrane was thinking along the same lines. Further, whereas Warren had been skeptical of Cockburn's proposal, Cochrane agreed with his subordinate that, quote, it is therefore but just that retaliation shall be made near to the seat of their, i.e., the Americans, government. Cochrane was out for revenge for the American attacks in Canada the year prior, particularly with the burning of York, the capital of Upper Canada. Cochrane and Cockburn had Washington, D.C. in their crosshairs, and we'll have to see next episode what happens, for our time together is drawing to a close. Thanks again to Lori from her half of history and John from Generals and Napoleon for providing the intro quotes for this episode. Once you're done with this episode, be sure to check out both of their podcasts anywhere fine podcasts can be found. I'll have links to both on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There, you can also find sources used for this episode, resources to learn more about all of the American presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the podcast. I'd like to take a moment to do a shout out to our patrons whose monthly pledges help to offset the cost of equipment and research materials for the podcast. Thanks so very much to Matthew, Michelle G., Jeremy, Ike, James, Terrell, Joshua, Eric, Michael, Howard, Scott, and Michelle for their continued support. If you'd like to join as a patron for as little as $1 a month to help to support the podcast, as well as to get access to an ad-free podcast feed along with other perks, just go to patreon.com/presidencies to sign up. If you're not ready to commit to recurring support but would like to make a one-time donation, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/presidencies or check out my research wish list on the website under the support section. You can also show your support by leaving a rating and review of the podcast on Apple Podcast, Podchaser, or anywhere else with that functionality. I do have a reviews section of the website, which is at presidenciespodcast.com, where you can leave a review directly there. Thanks so much to all of you who have taken the time to do so thus far, as it helps to get the word out there about why folks should be listening to the Presidency's podcast. Likewise, thanks to all of you who share information about the podcast on social media, as well as with family, friends, and colleagues offline. Word of mouth has connected so many folks with Presidencies over the years, and I can't wait to greet many more history fanatics who join us on this journey through American presidential history as we proceed along. Special thanks also to Christian of Your Podcast Pal for his audio editing work on this episode. Christian has been great to work with over the years, so if you're looking for assistance with editing your podcast, check out what services he provides at yourpodcastpal.com. Thanks to the folks at the Colonial Music Institute at George Washington's Mount Vernon, who graciously allowed us the use of clips from Hull's Victory as performed by David and Ginger Hildebrand for our intro and outro music. You can find out more about the great work that the Colonial Music Institute is doing to research and share information about early American music and dance by going to mountvernon.org and typing in Colonial Music Institute in the search field. If you'd like to reach out to me with any questions or comments you may have, feel free to send me an email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. Or you can connect with me on social media if you're not already. I'm on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last but certainly not least, I thank you for listening and being on this journey with me. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
The Korean War has sadly been known as the Forgotten War, but half a century earlier, the United States was locked in a bloody conflict in Asia that's been all but erased from the history books. Hi, I'm Alex Hasty, the host of Ohio vs. the World, an American history podcast on the Evergreen Podcast Network. In our newest episode, we speak to experts about the Philippine-American War, America's first Asian counterinsurgency conflict. The heroes, the villains. We'll discuss President McKinley, Admiral Dewey, the vicious brutality of the fighting, and the scandals and war crimes that nearly sunk Theodore Roosevelt's presidency. Check out our show, Ohio vs. the World, on the Evergreen Podcast Network for our new episode about America's most forgotten war. Now back to the show.